Gardenista, and in this video I'm going to show you how to build your own worm composting bin. Before you even bring your worm buddies home with you, or even start thinking about that really rich, organic, black gold that you're going to get from your worm composting bin, you've got to build the ideal worm environment for them to create that compost for you. First, you need to get all your tools and materials ready so you can do that. You're going to need a dark bin, actually two of them, with a lid, a drill gun, and either a 1/4 or 1/8 drill bit, scissors, and some screen glue that is waterproof. In this case, I'm going to show you how to use a hot glue gun in order to put your screen on those holes that you drill in your bin. The worm bedding, which is cut up carbon material, so that can be paper products with only black or white ink, cardboard or newspaper cut into different shapes and sizes. You've got your spacers to separate your two bins from each other to help promote that oxygen flow, and your kitchen scraps for your worms to eat. So first we're going to talk about the actual bins itself. These are two sizes, and I'm showing you these because I'm going to explain the different options and maybe what works best for you. So it is recommended to use an 18-gallon worm bin, but for beginners that might be a lot for several reasons. It's a lot to put together. Also, it might be too big for your home itself. For us Floridians, we have to think about the temperature of our worm compost bin, and that it can't be anywhere higher than 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you live in a condo or an apartment, then this might not be realistic for you. So this is the 18-gallon. This is more realistic for a smaller setting, something that you could probably fit up underneath your sink. And this is more of a 2-gallon size. I also do recommend this for beginners because you can actually start off small with a smaller amount of worms and smaller amounts of actually kitchen scraps that you're feeding into your worm compost bin. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this 18-gallon aside because we're not going to fool with it today. So you've got all your material set up. What you're going to do next is you're going to actually drill the holes into the bins itself. And why you're doing that is because you're promoting oxygen flow into your bin for two reasons. One is going to be your compost decomposition, as well as your worms. Your worms need oxygen in order to breathe, and you don't want to suffocate them. So we'll go ahead and set one of these aside. You're only drilling holes into one of your bins. This is going to be the main bin that all of your goodness is going to go into. We're actually going to drill holes onto the sides and onto the bottom here. It doesn't have to be all the way around, but I do recommend doing it in a uniform pattern because remember, the next step is going to be gluing the screen onto those holes to prevent your worms from escaping. So once you have your drill gun and your bit ready to go, you're going to drill holes into the sides and the bottom. I'm using a 1/4 drill bit. It's kind of a happy medium in that it's just big enough to promote that airflow, but not too large to where it's difficult for me to cover with slime. And so also when you're drilling into the plastic, you want to be careful because it can crack easily. I personally have done that, so don't make the same mistake that I have. And so when we start, drill with a 1/4 drill bit to drill the holes into the sides of the bin, like so. As you can see, we did it along the tops of the long edges as well as into the bottom of the bin. This is not only to help promote oxygen flow within the bin, but the bottom holes are going to help drain excess moisture and water in your bin that you don't want, which we'll talk about in a little bit at a little bit further steps. So the next step is going to be securing your worms inside your bin with the screen. So you've got your screen, you've got your scissors. I've pre-cut some of these screen bits so that they will cover. And you'll see I cut a little bit extra. Actually, that one's for the bottom one. I cut a little bit extra on the sides so that way I can make sure that it secures when I use the glue. Now, once again, you want to use waterproof glue because you want it to be secure. I'm gluing the screen inside of the bin, not on the outside of the bin. And we'll go ahead and make sure this is hot, ready to go. Looks like it is. And if you want to come this way, I'll show you. I'm going around each of these holes. And I'm going to make sure there's just enough to secure that screen. This is important because initially your worms might want to escape, but once they get more comfortable, I find you don't have that problem. It's really the first 48 hours that they're a little bit temperamental, like so. I'm going to place this on here and actually apply more glue on top to make sure that this is nice and secured. Now, as you can see, it's not going to be perfect, but it needs just to be functional. So it might not be pretty, but it just needs to cover the holes. So we just completed the step of securing the screen onto the sides as well as the bottom row of the worm bin. Once again, using waterproof glue. You don't have to. I used a hot glue gun, but that's just to secure your worm buddies inside there. Next step, we're moving on to add the worm bedding into your bin. So there's a couple key things to keep in mind with your worm bedding. Using cardboard material is great. As you can see, I've cut it up in different shapes and sizes. That's a good thing because it promotes airflow and burrowing within the bin. I actually soaked my cardboard overnight and then drained it so that it wasn't too moist. You don't want to actually drown your worms, which is possible. Fun fact, they actually breathe through their skin, so it is possible if there's too much moisture at the bottom of the bin that it's not going to be a good thing for your worms. So a rule of thumb or something to keep in mind is you want your bedding to be damp and moist, but not so much that water is actually draining out. So like a wrung out sponge. I'm going to cover the bottom of the bin about 1 inch with my damp bedding. Other things that you could use for your bedding material are paper products, newspaper cut up into different shapes and sizes. Just be careful not to use colored ink because the colored ink can be toxic to worms. You can also use yard waste. Just be careful not to introduce anything that might have diseases or synthetic chemicals into your worm bin. Not a good thing. I'd say, you know, like dried leaves that are organic would be a good option for you. So I've got the bottom of the bin covered about 1 inch for the worm bedding. Your next step is going to be adding a little bit of grit into your worm bin. This could be clean sand or organic soil. The reason why we're adding this is because worms don't have teeth. So they need something to help them grind up their food in order to digest it. So what you can do is use, this is some sand that we actually used on a construction project for our house. Just gonna use about a handful on one side just to add a little bit into that damp bedding right there. And moving on to the next step is actually adding the worm food. Another fun fact, worms don't actually eat your food in your yard scraps. What they do is they eat the microbes on your food scraps that are decomposing. Pretty interesting, huh? So a rule of thumb is to, for every pound of worms that you are putting into the worm bin, you want to do about a pound a week of worm food. That could be your kitchen scraps or your yard waste. Once again, you want to make sure that it is organic yard waste, not chemical, synthetic fertilizer or anything like that you're introducing into there. Since this is a smaller worm bin, I'm not going to be adding a pound of worms in here or a pound of food every week. So this is about, I would say, a week's worth of kitchen scraps. I'm going to be adding into there. Notice that they're chopped into small pieces, and that helps the decomposition and so forth. So we just added our kitchen scraps to our worm bin. The next step would be to actually add our worm buddies into there. I use red wigglers in my worm composting bin, and this is actually some of my compost with some worms at the bottom from one of my other bins that I'm going to be adding in. I mentioned this is a smaller bin, a 2-gallon bin, so I'm not going to be using a full pound of worms to add in here initially. And notice I didn't put all the scraps throughout it. I only did it on one side. As you can see, those red wigglers, which I like to use in my worm composting bin, are already going towards the bottom because they don't like the light. My next step is going to be lightly covering my worm buddies with a top layer of bedding. Now you don't want to smother them, so I just add a damp layer like so, not covering the whole thing, just enough to add some carbon material for some burrowing. So we have our worm buddies and our worm bin. They're covered by a top thin layer of bedding. Now we're going to place both of our bins together. So you're going to need some spacers in order to add a little bit of height to this top bin to help promote that air and oxygen flow. I'm using wine corks in order to separate my bins. I would recommend carefully choosing your material because you don't want it to be too heavy. So something like bricks is probably not a good option. So I'll show you. That creates a little bit of height between these two. And as you can see, you can still see the air holes on the sides of my bin. So that's ideal. That's the goal of those spacers. And then you only need one of the lids for your bins in order to close this off. So I'm going to probably be checking on this worm bin in the next 48 hours just to make sure that the moisture is good, all the different environmental factors are good. Like I mentioned, for us Floridians, we're going to want to keep our worm bins inside or at least in a temperature controlled environment. Lower than 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Also, I wouldn't recommend keeping this on top of your dryer machine in your laundry room, which I did get that question. Worms not only don't like light, but they don't like vibration and a lot of noise. So maybe up underneath your kitchen sink or somewhere in a place that you can keep an eye on these guys. And voila, there you go. That's how you build your worm composting bin on a shoestring budget in under an hour.